So in the last video, we saw a few ways to change an unwanted behavior, including some ways that avoid punishment altogether. That said, sometimes punishment is unavoidable or maybe our best tactic. So we're going to learn a little bit more about it in this video. Punishment is classified as a type of aversive conditioning because it's a type of learning that involves something aversive happening, or aversive just means something disliked, something unpleasant. If something unpleasant shows up when you do that behavior, that unpleasant thing is an aversive stimulus being added. If something nice is removed when you do the behavior, which is negative punishment, that's an aversive situation because you're losing something you like. And in fact, negative reinforcement is actually just a very different kind of aversive conditioning because it also involves reinforcing behaviors that get you away from unpleasant stimuli, that help you escape or avoid aversive stimuli. But we'll save negative reinforcement for an upcoming video. For now, let's talk about punishment. So let's start with a quick reminder of the 4 basic contingencies, some of which involve reinforcement where the behavior goes up, and some of which are punishment where the behavior goes down, and some of which are positive because the stimulus, a stimulus shows up after the behavior each time you do it, and some are negative because the stimulus gets removed immediately after doing the behavior. Now, positive reinforcement is usually the clearest one. We're probably familiar at this point. It's your reward for doing a good job, like getting an A on your studying or your dog getting a treat for sitting, things like that. Negative reinforcement means an aversive stimulus ends, it gets removed when you do the behavior, like learning to escape or avoid a shock by jumping over a barrier to get away from it. That jumping away behavior gets reinforced because it works. It makes things better for you, right? But then there's punishment. With positive punishment, something unpleasant is added or turned on when you do the behavior, like getting yelled at for bad grades, or the yelling is added, right? Or someone who physically hits their cat when it misbehaves. Please don't do this, but the hitting is added after the cat's bad behavior in an attempt to punish the cat's bad behavior. There's also negative punishment, where something good is removed or turned off as a result of the behavior. Each time you do the behavior, something good gets taken away from you. So getting grounded could be negative punishment in the sense that when you do the bad behavior, getting grounded removes your freedom, removes your fun experiences. Another example might be subtracting from your child's allowance every time they complain. The complaint behavior leads to the removal of money, which is negative punishment if the complaint behavior actually goes down over time. So let's really nail down this punishment distinction with just some examples of each of these. So positive punishment might be something like this. Drinking too much, right? That leads to a hangover experience being added. Notice the one who's doing the punishing here isn't a parent or a pet owner. It's simply biology itself, right? The world can punish us just based on its natural contingencies. But also things like misbehaving that leads to a spanking being added. That would be positive punishment. If someone makes a mistake in practice, sports practice, right? Like the behavior of a sloppy throw by a softball player. If that always leads to the coach adding sprints, that'd be positive punishment. Showing up to work late, right? That adds a write-up from your boss that gets added after you do the behavior, so hopefully punishes it. Burning food in your oven, right? Because that leads to a loud, obnoxious fire alarm sound being added to your environment. An aversive stimulus shows up when you do the behavior. If your behavior is making rude, snarky comments at your roommate, that might lead to the roommate yelling at you, right? That'd be positive punishment for your snark behavior. Again, all these will be positive punishment if they actually succeed in reducing the behavior. Without knowing whether it works, we can just say it's an attempt to reduce the behavior, an attempt to punish. Now, what about negative punishment? Some examples of that might look like misbehaving leads to being put in the corner or in timeout or in detention at school, because this removes fun activities. It takes away freedom, right? Takes something away when you do the behavior. Or the behavior of drinking too much at the bar, that leads to being cut off by the bartender. She removes your access to more drinks. Some might say criminal behavior is negatively punished because doing that behavior leads to jail. And that means, jail is a removal of freedom. It takes away all the fun activities you could do otherwise. Right? There might be other contingencies going on there as well, but that's one part of it, maybe. Making loud noises like, "Oh my God, honey, there's a raccoon outside. It's so cute," right? That's a behavior that might lead to the cute raccoon being scared away. It removes the cute raccoon. So if you want the raccoon to stick around in your future, you're going to stop making so much noise. Your noisy behavior is punished by the removal of the cute animals when you do it. That'd be negative punishment. Making a foul during a sports game leads to the player being taken out of the game, removes your ability to play. Swearing behavior leads to you having to put money in the swear jar. So the behavior of swearing removes or takes away money from you. So you're less likely to do that behavior in the future. Again, these would all be negative punishment only if they actually succeeded in making the behavior less probable in the future. Until we know if it worked, we would just say they're an attempt at negative punishment. At any rate, for the rest of the video, I want to really focus in for now on research that's been done on positive punishment, like the examples on the left here. To start, imagine this scenario. 8-year-old Tim is playing outside while his mom watches from the porch. Tim's ball rolls out into the street and he starts to go after it, but his mother screams his name. She runs up, grabs him, and shakes him violently. She's worried about him, right? So take a moment and ponder these two questions before moving on. How or why could this use of punishment be beneficial, and how or why could his mother's use of punishment be damaging? So a benefit in this case might be saving Tim's life, right? It might help him learn to be more careful around the road, which avoids a horrible accident. Punishment can be a way to teach someone very important things. Some side effects or downsides might be, Tim getting scared, perhaps scared of the road in a way that ends up being unhealthy, makes him afraid to leave his home in the future, or perhaps scared of his own mom in a way that damages their relationship. This may not actually happen, right? But that's the kind of thing we might worry about with punishment, especially if it's much more intense or scary in a way that might be out of proportion. So we're going to cover two things in this video and in the follow-up video. So how to do punishment in a way that's actually effective at decreasing behavior. In other words, how to get the benefits of punishment. If we are going to use it, how to do it well. And then in the next video, we'll talk about side effects of punishment, the ways it can have downsides or cause damage or trade-offs, limitations, things like that, when you use it to decrease behavior or if you use it inappropriately. So let's talk about effectiveness. How do you make positive punishment work? If you are going to use it, when is it actually effective? And we can summarize the research that's been done with the following sentence. Kind of long, but we'll just go through each part of it in turn. Positive punishment is most effective when abruptly delivering an intense, but not extreme, aversive stimulus immediately after every behavior. So let's break this sentence down into each of those parts it refers to and look at some of the research. So first off, punishment is most effective when the punisher is intense enough, but not extreme. As a general rule to start with, a higher intensity punishment means more behavior decrease. More intense does work better in general. Too mild of a punishment and it won't affect the behavior much or at all. If someone's trying to use spanking to decrease behavior, it's definitely not going to work if the spanking is a very gentle and soft tap, right? That said, the parenthetical here is very important. Higher is not always better in the sense that there is kind of a cap. If the intensity of a punisher is extreme, if it's too intense, then you end up suppressing all behavior, creating more like a freezing response or an escape response. At that point, it's actually harder to learn about the behavior that led to the punishment. At that point, you're kind of just shutting down. So more intense is not more effective without limit, right? There's a limit there. But there's more. For positive punishment to work, you need to give an intense enough punisher right off the bat, not building up to it. In other words, abruptly going straight to a moderately intense punishment is way more effective than starting with a really weak or mild punishment and building up to bigger and bigger punishments. Gradual buildup of punishment creates tolerance. It actually makes it very ineffective. Basically, if your initial punisher is so mild as to be not much of a punisher at all, then they just get used to it. And when you increase the punisher intensity, like yelling a little louder, they're actually going to be less affected by that volume than if you jumped straight to that volume the first time. Imagine someone telling their dog, "No, Henry, no, Henry, don't. No. Henry, no. Henry, no. Right? It's not just that this isn't the ideal way to do it. It's actually counterproductive, and you end up making them more immune to the punisher in general. In fact, a classic study showed this in the lab. If you give a 60-volt shock after they do the behavior, so you've set up a contingency, if they do the behavior, they get a 60-volt shock, that may not be enough to stop the behavior, right? Assuming it's something they really want to do, like the behavior gets them a treat that they really want and they're hungry, they might do the behavior even though there's a 60-volt shock. Then you up it to 65 volts when they do the behavior. Still doesn't work, still doesn't stop them. Try 70 volts. No. 75 volts. Nope. Keep going up and up and up and up and up and up. And eventually you can get to 130 volts and it still may not work as a punisher. Yikes. But here's the thing. If instead we just start at 80 volts right off the bat, if we just go straight to 80 volts at the start, that actually works really effectively as a punisher and they stop doing the behavior. So jumping to the appropriate level of intensity is important if you want the punisher to work. Don't start and build up gradually. Then there's this part near the end of the sentence. The punisher should be delivered immediately after the behavior if you want it to be effective. Research shows that longer delays have a weaker effect on behavior. A classic example of people not following this rule is yelling at your dog when you get home from work and you see a mess. It's incredibly ineffective at changing the dog's behavior. Not only that, but it may make the dog more neurotic or more afraid of you in general. So for one thing, the dog may not actually associate what you're doing right now with the behavior they did hours ago, right? They may not realize what behavior it is that's being punished right now. But we don't even have to talk about understanding or memory here so much as just the fact that this is a general rule of punishment learning. Every time we test it in the lab, in all situations, delayed punishment leads to less behavior change. It just doesn't work very well. Finally, there's this last bit at the end of the sentence. The punisher should show up after every time they do the behavior if you want to be most effective. In other words, a continuous schedule, right? A CRF-like schedule. So similar to continuous reinforcement, but here it'd be continuous punishment, right? That's what works best. Inconsistent punishment is much less effective. For example, if you yell at your cat to get off the kitchen table sometimes, but you ignore it going on the table when it's being really cute or when your friend is there, the yelling won't work as well. It's not as good of a punisher compared to if you yell every time. And guess what? If you aren't there to yell at the cat when it gets on the table in the middle of the night or when you're at work, then your yelling behavior isn't as effective as a punisher. That's why some people might come up with solutions that work even when they're not there. Like some people, temporarily might put aluminum foil on their counter. So when the cat jumps up on it, it gets the immediate scary, in this case, scary stimulus for the cat and punishes the cat's behavior even if you're not present. On a side note, notice that this lesson here about the sort of continuous schedule, it's different than what we saw with positive reinforcement. When we're doing reinforcement, intermittent is often the preferred type of schedule because it helps the behavior resist extinction and keep going. But with positive punishment, intermittent is actually bad to use. You really want to be consistent in that case. Okay, additionally, lots of research has shown that punishment works best when it's combined with other things. So if you are going to do punishment, you should also be doing other strategies to change the behavior. For example, building in some sort of differential reinforcement setup, or also doing extinction if that's possible, right? So that whatever the unhealthy behavior is, if you can make it less rewarding, that's great. Response prevention, if it's possible, right? Just the more you can make them not able to do that unhealthy behavior for a while, the less it'll be habitual for them. Things like that. Those work in conjunction with punishment, make the punishment work better. Also, if the behavior was initially occurring because it was being reinforced in some way, and honestly, that's basically all of our behaviors are in some way maintained by some sort of reinforcement, either internal or social or physical or whatever. But for example, if attention was reinforcing a self-harm behavior, like a kid hitting his head against the wall or hitting himself, then making that reinforcer less appealing, if attention was reinforcing, then making attention less appealing to that kid could make subsequent punishment to the behavior actually work better. So that when he does do the head hitting or self-hitting behavior, the punishment you're doing will work better if you've also made the behavior itself not as reinforcing, made the reinforcer not as useful. You can think of it like the trade-off between that reinforcement for the behavior no longer really outweighing the punishment that now is coming into effect. So How could you make the attention reinforcer less effective? Well, for example, you could satiate the kid, like fill the kid up with tons of unlimited attention. At that point, the attention during head hitting won't be as reinforcing, right? The attention they get when they start doing the self-harm and someone, the aide, comes over to help them out and says, no, stop, and, tries to help them. That's attention, right? But now that attention won't be as reinforcing if they've been getting attention all day long for every little thing they do constantly. So at that point, punishing the self-harm behavior actually works better. Another way to think of it is you're kind of coming at it here through the motivation part of our little operant conditioning shorthand that we used here. So if the unwanted behavior R is being maintained by some reinforcer, SR, right, some stimulus that's reinforcing, that's what's making them do the behavior in general, then you could kind of attack the motivation part here via an abolishing operation to abolish their motivation for that reinforcer. If you do that, then it turns out as a side effect, punishment of the behavior will also work better. So if your dog keeps eating out of the cat's food bowl and you want to add some punishment when it does that behavior, you're going to punish the dog every time it eats out of the cat's food bowl, your attempt will actually work better when the dog is full. And thus, the cat's food isn't as rewarding in that moment. All right, so we've talked about how to make positive punishment work if you're going to use it. And in the next video, we'll talk about side effects of positive punishment. But first, I want to briefly talk about how we might compare its effectiveness to something else, like, say, trying to use extinction to help someone. So I'm going to show you some data here. It's from a very old study. In fact, the majority of research into positive punishment was done quite a while ago. And nowadays, we usually leave, something like positive punishment as a last resort, which means it also isn't studied nearly as much these days as things like positive reinforcement. Okay, so this data here, this graph I'm showing, it's from a famous 1969 study, a series of data and graphs and everything, using extinction to minimize self-harm behavior in 2 boys who had autism. So observations had already suggested that for these 2 boys, attention was reinforcing their self-harm, their self-hitting behavior. Like when one started, hitting himself, an aide would come to him and try and get him to stop, which meant the self-harm behavior was successful. So here, the researchers said, let's try extinction. So for 90-minute sessions, the boy, whichever boy they were working with, the boy could do whatever he wanted, and his self-harm behavior wouldn't result in anyone rushing over to him, and thus no attention showed up as a reinforcer when he did the behavior. He's getting no reinforcement for it. That's extinction. We can see that the behavior indeed went down. Like, look at John. That's the filled in circles here. Look at John by session 10 or so. He's basically not doing the self-harm behavior at all anymore. Now, Greg, the other line here, Greg was going down, but obviously not completely. So around session 20, they actually started trying some other tricks in addition to extinction. So the DEP here, that's short for social deprivation, meaning they left him alone in a room for that session. SAT, that's short for satiation, meaning getting full, getting satiated. So they got Greg full with attention. They just gave him continual attention. The real kicker here is when they basically tried a brief little reversal design where you can see the REI here. That's short for reinforcement, meaning they went back to giving Greg attention when he self-harmed. So when he did the self-hitting behavior, they would actually give him attention. They'd say, no, Greg, stop, or whatever. They go to him, right? And what's interesting here, what you can see, sure enough, after a couple sessions of that, his self-harm behavior went up, right? It went up the first couple times they did this brief reversal and started giving him attention for it again. But eventually, the extinction went on long enough that the behavior went down to nearly 0. And by that point, even the last REI, the last reinforcement, the last kind of reversal here around session 55, didn't really increase the behavior, probably because he just wasn't doing it much at that point. He wasn't doing it enough that he would contact the attention reinforcer very often when they did start rewarding his self-harm with attention again. So what we have here on this graph, extinction seems to work. And surely this is a better option than, using positive punishment where they might yell at the kid or shock him for doing self-harm behaviors, right? Extinction would just clearly be better. However, there was a problem here. So one, the behavior didn't go away when the kids were in other rooms or in other contexts after this. In essence, we're seeing renewal in action. Remember how renewal is when you learn in one context, then you do extinction in a different context. You get rid of the behavior in a different context, but then the behavior can come back when you go back to the original context or to a brand new context. But also, second point here, a lot of self-harm was happening in these extinction sessions. Like all this time they were spending doing this extinction, look at Greg's data. It took a while to get him down to nearly zero. It took him a very long time. That is hundreds, sometimes thousands of self-harm behaviors for like 40 or 50 sessions. Yikes. But here's where the rest of the data from this study, from Lavas's study back in 1969, comes in, and why I'm discussing this with positive punishment. So let's compare this to trying to use positive punishment. Lavas also tried positive punishment just to see if it could actually help. In this case, they actually used a mild shock. They made it contingent on the self-harm behavior. So when the child self-harmed, they would get a mild shock. Kind of like one of those joy buzzers that you find surprising. It's annoying. It doesn't feel good, but it's not like they're really hurting them in a lasting way or anything. But yeah, it's shock. It's kind of shocking that people did this. We did human experiments, right, where the parents signed off on this, but that did involve shock to try and help their children, right? These are kids that were doing dangerous, like self-harm behaviors, hurting themselves. So they're trying something in order to help the kids. But in the top graph here, what we're looking at, start just by looking at the line with open boxes. So from the legend down here, you can see the open boxes. That's their frequency of hitting themselves. So that's kind of their self-harm behavior. And this is them in a 5-minute session. Each of these days, they're doing a 5-minute session. And we're counting up how much self-hitting behavior they're doing. Hundreds of times for the first 15 days or so. But then on day 16, if you look at this little label down here where day 16 is, the S means that's the day they turned on the shock conditioning, that they added the contingency where each time the child self-harmed, he got this mild shock. And sure enough, the behavior immediately stopped. It went down to basically zero, right? So what about the next couple days? Look at the graph as we continue on here. Even though the shock wasn't being used anymore, so there's no S, there's no shock contingency active during the 17th or 18th day, but he was doing a lot less of the behavior than he used to. So already it seems like this might have helped. Then on day 19, they did repeat the shock thing again. And you can see not only did the self-harm behavior go down to nearly nothing that day, it actually stayed at nothing for the next few days. And that's huge for a kid who was harming himself, who was hitting himself hundreds of times in these short periods, right? Now, however, if we look at days like 25, 26, and 27, the behavior is coming back, right? Now, why? Well, right below the day counter, so here it's days 25, 26, and 27, that's what we're looking at. Right below the day counter, notice these numbers here, the 2, 3, and 4, that line. That's the experimenter who he was working with during that day's session. So notice the days with shocks, those days he had experienced the shocks so far here, those 3 days, those had all been with experimenter 1, never with other people so far. So in some sense, the kid would be learning that experimenter 1 is a discriminative stimulus, an SD, a sign that today the shock is active or might be active, but experimenters 2 and 3, they might actually come to be an S delta, right? A sign that the shock contingency isn't active today. Hence why the self-hitting started returning around days 25, 26, and 27 when we had other experimenters there. He was with other people. But notice what happens on day 28 when experimenter 1 comes back. So if you look at day 28 here, experimenter 1 comes back. Now, there's no shock, right? Even without the shock contingency, the behavior goes back down to 0. And same thing the next day. But since experimenter 1 can't always be there, they wanted to generalize this kid's learning. So they actually added one more day with the shock contingency active on day 30 here, but this time with experimenter 3 being there when the shock was active. And if you look at the bottom graph now, not just the top graph, the bottom graph here, this is data from when the kid was in a different room for 15 minutes with some adults present. For the first 27 days, they just recorded his data. That's the baseline, right? But on days 29 and 30, they turned on the shock contingency out in this other room, in this other context, right? You can see the S here for a couple of days. And sure enough, with this, the self-hitting behavior, the self-harm behavior, it went away in a lasting way. And now, Even with the other experimenters, it stayed gone. Even weeks later, it's gone. Self-harm went away after just a few exposures to the positive punishment contingency using that mild shock. And it generalized to people not around during the punishment, like experimenters 2 and 4. For most of the month, that shock contingency had only showed up, right, when he's in a particular room with a particular person. But as soon as it showed up, even just a little bit in other situations, like a different room or a different person, that learning generalized and the behavior stayed gone across contexts, even at home, even in other rooms. By the way, after all these self-harm behaviors were gone, they used solely positive punishment with the kids, like treats and hugs and saying, "Good job," to teach them to communicate. These were kids who didn't have language skills. But in this case, we see that if punishment is done using the rules we talked about, it can potentially be an effective way to change behavior in a lasting, generalizable way. And it may actually happen quicker than something like extinction, which in this case means potentially hundreds less self-harm behaviors overall. So whether that makes it worth using, right, worth using punishment in extreme cases like this, it's more of an ethical debate. But the point is, data can help inform that debate. As I said, a lot of the classic research in positive punishment, it was done a long time ago, but there are still researchers looking at the times when it might be helpful or worth the trade-offs, both in basic research, so in a laboratory, and also in applied circumstances like therapy trying to help people. So for example, this 2007 case study, they added positive punishment, again, using shocks that were contingent on the target behavior happening. They added positive punishment to an existing positive reinforcement program for a boy who had really severe autism and was doing dangerous and aggressive behaviors. So the gray bars here, the tall gray bars here, are how many of these behaviors he was doing during baseline, when they were only using positive reinforcement for this kid. They were just reinforcing good behaviors, trying to help him with purely positive reinforcement. Notice during that time, the kid was doing hundreds of aggressive and health dangerous behaviors, in addition to those, major disruptive behaviors. But when they provided a mild shock after those behaviors, in addition to the positive reinforcement for other stuff, those behaviors all went down to basically nothing, right? 2 or fewer of those behaviors per week. In other words, positive punishment of those dangerous behaviors combined with positive reinforcement of the healthy behaviors actually seemed to work a lot better than just positive reinforcement of the healthy behaviors by itself. Okay. Enough, though, about the effectiveness of positive punishment for now. In the next video, I'm going to briefly discuss some downsides or side effects of positive punishment.